So if you want to stay in Matthew chapter 25, which was just read, that's where we're going to be this morning. And one of the things that was coming to my mind as Mike was giving his testimony was just that when Jesus said, "He who is forgiven much loves much." And what Jesus was illustrating there, as we know in the Gospels, was that the degree to which a person understands the depth that they needed forgiveness and that they've been forgiven such a large debt. They understand their own sin. They recognize that they've been forgiven. That fuels their love for God and for Jesus. And so everything about stewardship isn't just simply about, hey, you've got something you've got to get done. No, this is about our love. This is about the debt of forgiveness that we could never repay, could never return, yet God sent His Son to save us. So let us never forget that as we go into this parable that does speak to us about being very active as Christians, being very fruitful, industrious even as Christians. But we can never lose sight that it all should flow from the spring of love, that Christ's love and His mercy meets us right where we are. It's something that's been kind of ringing in my head. I love to write music, so I'm working on a new song, and one of the parts of the song is just, God, you meet me where I am. God, you meet me where I am. And that's what God does for us. Right? He doesn't say, I'm over here, come find me. God says, let me meet you right where you are, in the darkest place. And so here in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus is actually giving discussion, his final discussion called the Olivet Discourse. Okay, he's on the Mount of Olives with the disciples. He is approaching His crucifixion. He has told the disciples, hey, I'm going away and you cannot come where I am going. I'm going to die. I'm going to be raised again. And this is some of the final discussions that Jesus is having with His disciples. And so this discussion actually begins in Matthew chapter 24, where it says in verse 3 of chapter 24 that Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives. That's why we call it the Olivet Discourse. And the disciples came to Him privately. So this is a private discussion that you and I get to enter into with Jesus and His disciples. His disciples come to Him privately saying, Jesus, please tell us when these things will be. Tell us, we want to know more. Like, when will you come back? And when will you set up your kingdom? And what's all this future stuff going to look like? And what will be the sign of your coming? And then Jesus proceeds to give a number of parables and a discussion to essentially say to them, don't be so focused on the future that you forget about the present. Don't be so focused on having your eyes in the heavens that you're not doing much earthly good for the Lord here. And so He gives a series of parables. One is on the 10 virgins who were waiting. That this parable, just previous to this one that Greg just read, is the parable of the 10 virgins and how it was a wedding and the groom was kind of the star of the show in some ways in the first century. It was him who had to fund the wedding, pay for the wedding, and the 10 virgins were waiting for him to come out of his house. And it was a very exciting time when the groom would come out. These days it's a little bit different, right? It's like you have all the flash and the pizzazz, and it's generally about the bride, and it's like, and the groom's there too. He made it. Sweet, right? Here it's the waiting for the groom, and he comes, and the 10 virgins, this is about them waiting patiently. Don't make sure you're watching and waiting for the groom to come. That's Jesus. Now Jesus moves to this parable, which the previous parable focused on waiting. This parable focuses on working, being fruitful. Not just waiting, saying, okay, we'll just sell everything and we'll just wait because Jesus is coming soon. Well, yeah, you're right. He's coming soon. We don't know when, but what is He calling us to do? To work, to be active, to be fruitful. So that's what this parable of the talents is all about. But it's in that setting of where Jesus is giving some of His final instructions to His disciples. So it's a very, very important conversation. I came across a quote in a commentary I was reading. I really liked it. There's nothing super flashy about it. It's just truth. He said, as Christians, we need to live like Jesus is coming back today. That's how we should live. Every day, we need to live like He's coming back today. But we should plan like He's not coming back for 1,000 years. And that really falls in line with these two parables. We should live like He's coming back today, And it's not just simply like, well, I hope he doesn't see me doing something sinful when he comes back. Catch me, like, whoop. It's not just that. It's live as if he's coming back today, but plan like he won't be coming back for 1,000 years. Be fruitful, be active, yet be ready, be waiting. So these two parables in tandem are all about Jesus giving this last discourse. And this parable of the talents, which many of us are familiar with, this idea of a talent, which generally is defined, as we'll see in our culture, as a skill and an ability, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, but our English understanding of the word talent came from this passage, because that is not ultimately originally what the word talent meant, so we'll talk about that. But this parable essentially, as I've titled this sermon, is about maximizing our gifts and our talents for the master. Right? That's what stewardship's all about, isn't it? That everything we have, all that belongs to us, to every breath that I have, to every skill that I have, to every note I could play, to every song I could sing, to every time I get down and play with my child or other children and interact with them, that my goal and my mindset is, how can I love you that would be pleasing to the master? How can I reveal Jesus to you? How can I come alongside you as God has met me where I am? How can I meet you where you are? And what has God given me that he wants me to use? This is a singular focus this morning. A focus of you, between you and God. What has he given you? Not what he has given somebody else, but what has he given you? And you may think it's little, but as we will see, God is the master of multiplying our gifts and our abilities to maximize his own glory. And so here we are in the parable of the talents. And this main idea of this text, as we'll walk through, as it was read, is that whatever talents God has given you must be maximized for his glory. We got a lot of maximizing of gifts in our culture. We see it all over the place. People are maximizing their gifts. They use their talents and their abilities, and we can see and think of examples, whether it's Michael Jordan, who got cut, and he played basketball when he was younger, but then he worked really hard and he was able to become one of the greatest basketball players who ever lived. Or other people who are more industrious. They thought of a particular need that we saw in the culture, and they were able to invent this product or invent this particular thing, and they maximized their abilities. But isn't it in many cases? Although we have benefited from some of the maximizing of people's gifts in our culture, but when you study those individuals' lives who don't know Jesus, do you know what often is left is a trail of tears and broken relationships and people fighting and backbiting and destroying one another over what's mine, what's mine, what's mine. See, but this is different for us as Christians, that what we have, we want to share, not for our own selfish benefit. What we have, we want to maximize, not for my own fame and glory, not for my own attention, but so that I would be a window that people can see through me and see Jesus. So whatever talents God has given you, that's what we're going to learn here. We've got to be maximized. God didn't save us to sit on the bench, but to get in the game. God didn't enlist you as a soldier just to have you retreat, but to move the line. It would be unthinkable that a soldier would see his friends fighting on the front lines as he's off in the corner drinking coffee, reading a newspaper. It'd be unthinkable. God didn't employ us in his service just to have us walk off the job. He has work for us to do to be fruitful. And I'll say, as I've said before, say again 100 times more, you cannot do this without the starting point of a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. You see, if you don't have a personal relationship with Jesus, could you see it, as Mike spoke, that it's real? It's not just based on some mystical feeling. It's not just based on some experience he had. It is a real relationship that he has with Jesus based on faith alone. And he lives his life out of that relationship. There's so many people who think they have a relationship. They know something about God. They don't know nothing about God. You can know all kinds of facts about God, but so you can be the farthest person from God. We'll even see that in this parable. Can't do it without a saving relationship. Because if I don't have a saving relationship, I'm going to think that God wants me to do something for him because it's really just about me trying to earn my way to heaven, and that's very fear-based, or it's just about viewing God from a wrong way. That's not at all what it's about. So it's got to flow from our relationship. It's got to flow from our love, our worship. Can't do that for you. You have to truly love God more than this world. And then see yourself and all that God has given you, not to be used for yourself, but to share, to give, to be generous. Whatever God has given you must be maximized for His benefit. And as we quickly kind of do a flyover of this parable, I want to give you 4 principles that will help us to apply this parable. All right, 4 principles, because what we're going to find is this isn't just simply a story about a master and, it's some ancient fragment about what a master did in the business times of the first century, and we have that. We find fragments like that. They're very interesting. This is not one of them. This is a symbolic parable in which Jesus Himself is helping you understand what it's like to live here and now in the kingdom and for the kingdom that's coming. So number 1, we'll see this in verse 14. And it might kind of assault your Western senses, so I'm sorry about that, but it might wake you up if you're a little sleepy this morning. Number 1, okay, Christ is your master. That's not too surprising. And you are His slave. What you'll see in this text in Matthew 25, verse 14, it says that Jesus said, for it will be like a man going on a journey. So Jesus is going to explain to them what it's like that He's going away, and there's going to be a period, which you're in, by the way, that we're waiting for Jesus to return, and He's saying, this is what it's like. So listen, pay attention. It's like a master, and Jesus is the master. And He called His servants, this is verse 14, and entrusted to them His property. That word servant in the original Greek, Koine Greek, first century language, is the word for slave. Doulos almost always means slave. Now you might ask yourself, why did the English translators generally translate it as servant? Well, I'll tell you, but you can also read a whole book on it that John MacArthur wrote called Being a Slave of Christ. And this word seems to have been chosen to be represented as servant, probably because of some of the Western negativity and influence of Western slavery, and the idea that they were trying to shy away from people thinking about it in that way. But this word is the word slave. This master had slaves that were employed in his service, and he called them, and they were expected to answer, and whatever instructions he gave, they were to do that because they belonged to him. Now, they probably, like I said, avoided the word, but that's what the word means. Jesus is not by any means giving approval to any sinful behaviors related to slavery, so perish the thought. He's just simply doing what He always does. When He's out and about, He uses what people understand and know to explain spiritual truths. Look at the birds of the air. They neither toil or they don't run around anxious, but your Heavenly Father feeds them. We all understand birds. Well, at that time period in the first century, everybody understood slavery. Many of the people He were talking to each day were slaves. 10% of the population in the Roman Empire were slaves, they estimate. That's a lot of people. So He's simply using an illustration that everybody would understand so that He could teach them a truth about kingdom living. So, number 1, Christ is your master, you're His slave. If you're a believer here, what it means is that you have surrendered living for yourself and being your own master. The thing about the difference between Western slavery, we don't have time to talk about all of it. I'd love to. So have me over, we'll have coffee. We'll talk about it. Love history. The difference, don't think of slavery like Western slavery. Western slavery was atrocious, and it was based on a person's ethnicity and their skin color. In the first century, anybody, anywhere, anytime, any skin color could be a slave. If you lost your business, you lost all your money, you had nowhere to go, you had no home to live in, sometimes the only solution was for you to simply go to a master and say, basically, can I be your slave and you take care of me and I'll work for you? And you had a better life than living on the street. So there's a vast difference. Spartacus himself, who almost led an entire slave revolt in the Roman Empire, he himself was a slave. And got free, was just going along the empire, freeing slaves, and they almost revolted against the whole Roman Empire. So very, very different than just simply Western, the idea of Western slavery. That's not the mindset that Jesus had, was not our general understanding. So when we think of the idea that Christ is our master, what then does it mean to be a slave of Christ? Okay, let me run through this quickly. There are 3 answers to what it means to be a slave of Christ under this point. To be a slave of Christ means you are bought by Christ. You are his property. You belong to him. Now, to be a slave in almost any other sense than to be a slave of Jesus would maybe not be the greatest lot in life, but let me tell you, to be a slave of Jesus, I have found, and I'm sure many of you as well, is one of the most liberating things I have ever experienced, is to be a slave of Jesus Christ. To be finally free. To know that I have a free conscience. I can live in freedom. My master has brought me into his home. I don't have to think about a thing because he loves me. He cares for me. And when I experience hardship, I know he's going to meet me where I am. It's one of the most liberating things to be a slave of Jesus Christ. You were bought with a price. You're not your own, 1 Corinthians 6:20 says. You were bought with the precious blood of Christ. So glorify God in your body. To be a slave of Christ means you were bought by him. You belong to him. That's one of the greatest truths in all of the world. Your identity, your value, who you are, what's been done to you, what hasn't been done to you, where you've gone, where you haven't gone, whether you've been successful, unsuccessful, it doesn't matter. It's not your identity. My identity is that I am a property of Jesus Christ. That is the most liberating thing in all the world. You got to get that. Number 2, to be a slave of Christ means you're under his authority. We don't like authority in our culture, I get it. But it's not going so hot for us, is it? Everybody wants to be their authority, but the whole country's falling apart. You can't even wonder if you can even go to a mass gathering anymore because someone's going to get shot somewhere. It's sad. We've abandoned God's authority. But to be a slave of Christ means you're under his authority. Your soul is bound to him. You don't have to obey his will. You are blessed to obey his will. So it means you're under his authority. What else does it mean to be a slave of Christ? Number 3, it means to move by his direction and guidance. Okay, so what you see of these servants, the master calls his servants, it's not like, if you feel like it. It's like they belong to him. Like they have to answer. They're under his guidance and instruction, especially when he's away. His calling was a command to be fruitful. And so, if you claim the name of Christ, then mark my words, and really mark the words of Scripture. It's not my words. You cannot live for yourself if you're truly a slave of Jesus. If you say you believe in Jesus, if you say you love him with all your heart, then the reality is, how are you living as a property of your master, commissioned by your master? That is what this text is all about. You cannot say Christ is your master and live as if you're your own master. It doesn't work like that. You might as well just come out and say you don't really believe in him, just be your own God. And that ain't going to work for you, but I'm just telling you. You might as well just be honest. But right stewardship begins by knowing your identity. Slave of Christ. That's who I am. I'm just a slave of Christ. I'm not here for my fame. I'm not here for my glory. I'm not here to do anything other than just hear the words, faithful. You're faithful. You've just done what I've asked you to do. And you kept your eyes on me. Is that your heart's desire? I hope it is. Because if stewardship doesn't start there, it's going to end bad. So number 1, Christ is your master. You are his slave. That's the first principle. What's the second principle? All your talents and abilities belong to God. Look at verse 14. He entrusted to them his property. It belonged to the master. So everything that the master has given you, it belongs to him, and he has entrusted it into your care. That's what Stewardship Month is all about. Does anyone here remember grab bags as a kid? I don't know, they still have them sometimes, but one of my favorites, I was talking to my mom about it, and she tote me around, and you go to the dollar store, you go into a store, they got the brown paper bags rolled up, the mystery bags. One says boy, one says girl. You grab the one for the boy or the girl, but you don't know what's in that baby. It's only $1. You grab that, and something's in there. There's a number of things in there, but generally it was like a bunch of peanuts and a couple good things, right? But the reality is that the master has entrusted to you your own little grab bag. And you don't always know what's in it till you start using the little things in there. And then the Lord's like, hey, I know you didn't notice it, but look in the bag again. There's another thing in there. But it happens as I use the little things that God has given me and I'm faithful there, then he's like, did you see what else is in your bag? Right? So all your talents belong to God. He entrusted to his servants his property, and he gave them each according to their own ability. Right? So they received, according to their own ability, we'll talk about, and they received a talent. Let's talk real quickly about this. What is a talent? Well, originally a talent was a unit of weight. So before it became a unit of currency, it was a unit of weight, about 125 pounds. And it would be a unit of weight of either copper, gold, or silver. We don't know exactly which one Jesus is referring to here, but in the end, it's not the most important thing. It was probably silver or gold. But a talent was a weight, and then it eventually became used as a unit of coinage. I possess a talent, and that meant a certain amount of money. And it's hard to know exactly the exact amount as we study history. But a talent was equivalent to 6,000 denarii. Okay, so 6,000 denarii, just to give you an idea, that's how much the average labor, a laborer would make not 6,000, 6 denarii in 1 week. That's all he would make. And it would take the average labor 1,000 weeks to earn 1 talent. That's around 20 years. Right? So this is a large sum of money. And I took the average that a person makes, say in America, and I times it by the weeks and different things, and it's roughly around a little over $1 million. So each talent in today's money would be equivalent to $1 million. This is a lot of money that this master is entrusting to these servants. One he gave $5 million, one he gave $2 million, and one he gave $1 million. So this is a large amount of the master's property. This is a huge responsibility. Right? This isn't like, these were servants and slaves who had in little ways proven like they could possibly handle this. They should be able to handle this. But as we'll see from the story, that 2 of these servants were true followers of the master and 1 was not. We'll talk about that as we go. But what a responsibility. This is where the word talent comes from. Now, all the way fast forward to today, we use the word talent. If you look it up, the word talent is referring to an ability or a gifting, and some could be a natural talent, could be a spiritual one. It's really an ability that you have. And that really is fall in line as well as what Jesus is talking about here. But the reality then is all your talents and abilities belong to God. So the question is what are you doing with God's property? You know, when you look at something, it says property of so-and-so. Right? It has their initials on it. All of my older brothers, we all have the same initials. So you can take that up with my mom, but it's Jeremy, David Steffens, Josh, David Steffens, Jesse, Jim, John, we all have the same initials. So that became very difficult when we're playing video games. Who's got the high score? You got to put in your initials. We had to figure out unique ways, right? Because I clearly would have the high score. But property, you put your initials on something. Well, God's got his initials on everything. Everything in your life, everything in your grab bag, everything, everywhere belongs to him. Doesn't mean you don't get to enjoy things. Doesn't mean you don't get to have some personal enjoyment. Of course, he's a good God. Look at the world that he made. Everything he has given us to enjoy as long as we put him first. That's all he asks. Love him. Put him first. Enjoy all of creation. Just love God with all your heart. What have you been given, and what are you doing with it? We don't have time to apply it in every single way, of course, but I'm praying that as the Lord works in your heart, you think, man, how can I get involved? What can I do? What has God given me? I know this little thing's in my grab bag. I should use that. I should really get involved here, church. There's a table out there. I should probably sign up at that. Probably should sign up at something because guess what? Everybody can have the gift of cleaning the church. Yes. Right? That's in your grab bag. I know it is. You know why? Because I'm director of toilet services in my own house. And I didn't need the title to do it. You just do it because you're a family. Right? And the more people that get along and sign up, and the more people that help, it almost feels like it doesn't take any effort to do it. Boy, but if a few people only sign up, it becomes drudgery. And then you start to lose your joy a little bit. So what have you been doing? God's got his hands on his initials on everything. All your talents and abilities belong to God. We see that in verse 15. Now let's move a little further. Principle number 3, you must excel at using your talents. It's not just enough to acknowledge, okay, you're my master, I'm your slave, you've given me property, you've given me all that I have. Okay, let's just leave it at that. No, he issues a command to his servants. I've given you 5, I've given you 2, I've given you 1 talent. Now I want you to be industrious. I want you, as I'm gone, to excel at using these talents in my service. And, it's not uncommon. I mean, maybe you've experienced this. I know I have. I worked landscaping for 9 years, and it was not uncommon that people that I worked with would work differently when the boss, which was my father-in-law, was on the job site. When he was on the job site, you would see people work differently. But when he would leave the job site, things could get a little messy. And isn't that the same true for us as Christians? This is what the whole story is about. I'm going away, and while I'm gone, don't think that I'm not coming back. You got to excel. You excel at using your gifts. So in verse 16, what did these servants and these slaves, what did they do? Well, servant number 1 in verse 16, he who had received the 5 talents, he went at once. He didn't delay. He didn't say, I'll get to it tomorrow. He didn't wear the shirt that says procrastinators unite tomorrow. He just went for it. Now, what did he do? I don't know. He took the $1 million and he invested it. He maybe bought businesses and he sold and he traded and he was very industrious because whatever gifts he had, he was good at it and he was entrusted by his master and he had 100% return on his investments. That's pretty amazing. Talk to Edward Jones about that one. 100% return on his investments. Wow. So the first servant, wow, he invested those 5 million, that 5 talents. He made 5 more. The second servant, he did the same. He went and he made 2 talents more. But here's this third servant. He went and he dug in the ground and he hid his master's money. So he went right away, supposedly, but what he did was dig a hole and bury what the master had given to him. Burying $1 million. You ever heard of the saying that it takes money to make money? If you had a large sum of money, we've all thought that, haven't we? If I had a large sum of money, then I could use that money to make money. I mean, that's what he could have done. We'll see that in the story. But he buried it. Now, there's a story that came out last year that a man was digging on his property in Kentucky, and he found what is now called the Great Kentucky Hoard. He was digging, doing something on his property, and he found upwards to 700 Civil War era coins that somebody buried in mint condition, estimated to be valued around $2 million, just on his property. And somebody somewhere back then thought, let's bury this. Now, that's no benefit to them who buried it. Now, it's benefit to the guy today who got it, right? But he's benefiting from it. But the person who buried it received no benefit from that money. They buried it. It was gone. It was useless to them. Sat for years. And now this guy found the Great Kentucky Hoard. But that's what this servant did. He just buried it. What are you doing with God has given you? Are you burying it? That's the question out of this parable. What is God? It doesn't need to be the big things. It doesn't have the flashy things. We don't need titles. I just read one of those little books last night on why should I serve in my church? And it was like, you don't need a title to pray. You don't need a title to love on the kids. You don't need a title to make coffee. I don't need a title, director of entertainment for my children. But I am director of entertainment for my children. Yesterday, brought Aaron over to the gym thing and the toddler time, and man, we were just going nuts in there. I didn't need a title. I need to obey and do what's right. And love my kids, love my family, love my church. Don't bury it because you need it. I'm telling you, my whole life in ministry, I said this at Growth Group, I still to this date, maybe you could be the first one, go for it. Still to this date, have never had anyone come to me and say, I don't know what my gifting is and I know I need to be used in this church. Will you help me get plugged in any way possible? I mean, we got the table out there, right? Now, the next step is you've been entrusted with whatever you signed up for, and then the next thing is what am I going to do with it? Am I going to be faithful to that task? And I'll tell you this. Mike was talking about Charles Spurgeon. I listen to a lot of his messages sometimes that are dramatized. And he was speaking on this passage, and he said, God will not ask you what your church did, but what you did. Like, oh, our church is doing these sports fields. Yeah, No, it's not what your church is doing. What did you do to have any part in that? Oh, our church has this counseling ministry. No, what are you doing? It's really easy to say, oh, I'm part of this church that's doing these things. But it's a whole nother thing when you look at it individually and go, what am I doing? Our church did movie nights to serve others. Yeah, you're right, but have you been there? Are you on a movie night team? He'll ask you what you did. Right? So you got to manage these, and your talents and your abilities belong to God, and you got to manage them. We see that in verse 18. Now, let's get to the principle number 4. God will give the final progress report. Now, remember in the story, these are his servants, these are his slaves. They're in a relationship with him. This final progress report is not whether or not you get into heaven. Okay, Christianity is not based on what a person does to earn their way to heaven. There is nothing you can do to earn your way to heaven. There is no one good enough. There was no one who hasn't done or has done something that will gain their entrance into heaven. No, this is about us just being faithful in loving our Master who bought us and brought us into his family. God will give the final progress for it. Here we see in verse 19. Now, after a long time, we don't know when, how long, don't know, but in the ancient times when someone took off, there's no contact. Unless like months and weeks, but letters sent back and forth. So after a long time, the master, which is represented as Jesus, of those servants, which is represented as Christians, he returns and he came to settle accounts with them. It's not uncommon in the business world. We do progress reports or we do evaluations in which we have to meet with our boss and he goes over and it's just kind of a standard thing, right? Well, on a whole nother level, Jesus is going to do that with us. He's going to call us and say, now, what have you done with what I have given you? And that's what we see, is Jesus will give, and God will give the final progress report. So look here in verse 19. After a long time, the master of those servants came, settled accounts, and he who had received the 5 talents came, and he said, bringing his 5 talents, said, Master, you have delivered to me 5 talents. Here, I've made 5 talents more. His master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You see, the emphasis is not on the amount. Whether 5 or 2, whether the 5 made 5 or the 2 made 2, the amount is not the focus, right? So the degree to which, someone else has those talents, or there's other pastors who are really big churches, woo-hoo, that amount doesn't matter to the Lord. What matters to the Lord is that I've done and I've been faithful to what he's entrusted to me. So he says to both of the servants, the 2 that made 2, the 5 that made 5, he says the same commendation. Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy. The amount that they made was different, but you know what was the same? The cup of joy was full to the brim for both. So he says, to either the one or the other, at the end of the day, you are faithful to what I called you to do. If in the world's eyes it is little, so what? But if it's done for Christ and his glory, it is huge. And you will hear the words, enter into the joy. I will set you over much. Now, people have this idea sometimes that heaven is just going to be this place where you get, you check in, you get your harp, you get your cloud, and then you find cloud A, B, whatever, wherever you are, and you sit on your cloud and you play your harp. For me, it'd be a guitar, right? Just, But to me, that would be almost like, well, 1, it's not biblical. 2, that would be like being locked in an amusement park. Like amusement park, yeah, I've rode all the rides, yeah. I think I'm ready to go home now. I'm locked in. Heaven's not going to be like that. Heaven will be perfect, yes. Heaven will be without sin, yes. It will be without tears. But we will do what we were called to do, even here, which is to be fruitful for the Master. We will have tasks to do. We will have things that he calls us to do. What are they, Pastor? I don't know. I don't know exactly. But it's not going to be sitting on a cloud strumming your harp. I'm just telling you, it's not. He'll give the final progress report. And think about this. As a Christian, how fruitful I am here will in some ways determine what those tasks are in the future. Now be careful here, because we don't want to be motivated by, here's what I'm going to be doing in heaven. See, we can get selfish real quick with spiritual things. It's not about the amount, you see. It's about just eyes on Jesus, eyes on what he's given me, and I'm going to take what he's given me, and I'm just going to try to use it, cultivate it, multiply it. And if he wants me to do something else, And if he wants me to have bigger tasks, he'll let me know. Right? And it's the same as a job, right? Like, you ever had people who are in a job situation? It's like, I deserve a raise. I deserve this. I should be in this position. I should be in that position. It's like, but you don't even show up on time. You call in sick every other day. You don't even do the tasks that are asked of you, and then you whine and complain, and you're talking about the boss in the break room. You're not going to get any higher tasks when you act like that. You have to be faithful to what you've been called to do. And then maybe then you'll get called up to higher tasks. He comes back. Now we get to the third progress report of the master, or of the slave who came, and he said to the Lord, he said, Lord, here it is. I brought it back to you. And I can imagine maybe he's timid, maybe he's afraid. The other two, you could sense their joy. I'm not sure I would call it pride, but I think there's a sense of accomplishment that's not wrong within boundaries that we Christians have, where it's like, I did what God asked me to do. I'm happy that I did what God called me to do. It's okay that they have that joy, that sense of accomplishment, because it's not for other people. It's not for their praise. It's for the praise of God alone. But this servant comes in verse 24, and he says, as he comes and down, he says, actually here in verse 24, who had received the 1 talent came forward saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and I buried it. So here it is. Here you go. I'm out. Now, what's going on here? The other two had a view of God that was correct. They understood that it was a joy to live and work and be the master's property because they were bought with a price. This third servant, he says that he believes in God, but his view of God is so off base that it led him down roads to bury the treasure and accuse God of being things that God is not. That happens all the time in our culture. People accusing God. It happens all the time. I talk to people, it's like, oh yeah, God is like this, and he's like this, and if God were like this, then why is there this in the world? I'm like, have you ever read the Bible? Well, no, not really. Like, cover to cover? Like, I've read it multiple times. And I can assure you, you don't know who you're talking about. You take one passage of Scripture, and then you drill into that, and you mold your own view of God. That's what this servant did. That's what he did. He had a wrong view of the heart of God. He said, I know you, God, to be a callous person. That's what that word means. Hard, callous. I still have calluses on my hands. You can kind of see them from when I landscaped. I didn't like wearing gloves, and you just develop these calluses where you can just work, and then it doesn't hurt anymore. And that's what he said is of God. Like, God, you're a very callous person. You're hard. And so I knew you to be that way. He's not that way. The heart of God is mercy, grace, kindness, forgiveness. Well, but God judges, doesn't he? Yes, he does judge, but he is so patient, so long. In fact, he hasn't come back yet to receive his own. Do you know why? Because he's waiting for you, some of you, to repent and turn to Jesus. He's waiting for you. He doesn't want to come back because he knows that'd be it for you. So he's patient. He's kind. This servant had a totally wrong view of God. Callous, cold, hard. Doesn't care about what people go through. That's not the God who meets me where I am. Not only that, but he had a wrong view of the behavior of God. He said, Lord, I know that you reap where you did not sow and you gather where you did not scatter. This was the first century terminology where when they get the wheat, they would spread it out so it would dry, and then someone would have to come back and collect it. And basically what he's saying is I know your behavior, God, that you're really about kind of just about yourself, and you just kind of take things from people, and everybody's just their own little pawn in your game. That's not who God is. It's not at all who he is. But that's who this servant thought that he was. And so he thought that he had an excuse to based on that false views, to have this response. Okay, God, I know you're callous, and I know that you're really just about yourself, and you're kind of like the Greek gods who are just sinful people blown up really big. That's all the Greek gods were. So I was afraid of you because no matter what I did, I'll probably get in trouble because I'm totally just fear-driven by you, which is not at all who God is. So what I did was I hid it, and I buried it. He even admitted that it belonged to the master. He knew that what the master had given him was his property, so he brought it back. And Many might give this person an excuse, but I assure you, Jesus doesn't give this person an excuse. What the response of Jesus is the truth that he needed to hear. His master answered him in verse 26, "You wicked and slothful servant." And he kind of plays his game with him. Like basically, if you thought that I was this way, then you could have at least brought my money to the bank and said, "Here, take this." And that Roman first century, they would do similar things today. They would take someone's money and then they would lend it out to others, and then you could make interest off that and all those things. And Jesus was saying, you could have done that. If you thought that I was such a bad person, you could have at least, but you did nothing. That's the thing with this servant. He did nothing. The question is, what was he doing with his time? When he buried it, what did he do then? Did he just sit on it? Did he just sit there, grab a lawn chair, sit there? He did nothing. He had to have been doing something with his time, his own endeavors, his own selfish pursuits, his own business. I don't know what it was, but he did nothing. He did nothing. And it revealed his heart. And Jesus said, "You wicked and slothful servant. You could have done something with this, but you didn't." Verse 27, "Then you ought to have invested it, but you didn't." Verse 28, so here's what's going to happen. Take the talent. Take the $1 million from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. Now, don't read too much into that. It's just simply the person with the 10 talents, they were pretty faithful, and the Lord just in the story decided, hey, give it to the guy who was faithful with the 5. Give it to the one who had the 10 talents. Verse 29, "For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have in abundance." So these first 2 servants were believers. They drank of the same cup of joy. They heard the same, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." But this last one didn't know Christ, had a wrong view of God. And I think that's very common in our culture. People who don't truly, they know of Jesus through what some dumb church did and some behavior of some foolish Christian. And then they assume and they overlay that on God as if somehow they're going to meet God and go, well, I have an excuse, X, Y, Z, whatever. There will be none. And for us as believers, the thing that drives us home on this text, I think, is that, man, what do you want to find yourself doing the rest of your life? Like, if you get all the money you could ever have and you pursue all the selfish pursuits you could ever want, are you ever going to be satisfied in this life? As we talked about that in adult Bible study, there's no U-Hauls attached to a hearse. It's unlike with the Egyptians where they'd bury all their belongings with the Pharaoh. Didn't do them any good. But for us Christians, what do we want to be known for? I want to be known for just making God big and showing people who He really is by being faithful to what He's called me to do. Now, as we close, you might think, yeah, but what do I have to offer? What are my gifts? There are certain things that God just simply asks us to be faithful with the small things first. Right? It could be prayer. Anybody can pray. That's the thing about prayer. The disciples said, "Lord, teach us how to pray." That's not, you basically have to set aside your time and talk to Jesus. Anybody can do that. It could be just the small things of looking at your life. It's been very challenging for me this month, just thinking about the different things the Lord has entrusted in my life and seeking to lead and guide this church. It's very humbling because it's impossible for me to do on my own. But I'll tell you, remember when Jesus fed the 5,000? And the disciples said, how are we going to feed all these people? 200 denarii isn't going to be enough to feed these people. And Jesus said, what do you got? Tell me what you got. Well, there's this little kid over here about a basket, 5 loaves, 5 barley loaves, 2 fish. But what is that? Remember those words in the Gospels? What is that among so many? You see, what you bring, as long as you bring your whole heart, and you bring your small little 5 loaves and your 2 fishes, do you know what the Lord can do with that? He can maximize it. He can multiply it. And He can do with it what you never thought was possible. See, it isn't about me comparing myself to others. That's not the focus. The focus is not, what do you have in relation to what I have? How many talents do you have versus how many talents I have? It's not about that. It's just being faithful to the Master who has called us. And if you bring Him your 5 loaves and your 2 fishes along with your whole heart, watch what He can do through us, through your life, and through this church. All right, well, let's pray together as we close.